Good afternoon again. I think you can hear me now. First, I would like to say well done to this great audience which has been with us for so many hours. There is no doubt that Iran is a topic that interests everyone in Israel, and I do appreciate the fact that you've been sitting here for such a long time. This is the beginning of the last panel for today, and you can see the participants, the panelists. I don't think that there are four other people in the state of Israel who have been more involved in the last 30 years in Israel's national security than the people seating here. I know that you all know them, which is why I'm not going to say everything that every one of them did in their lives, in his life. To my left, we have Lieutenant General Moshe Bogie, Senior Research Fellow. He was the head of intelligence, and he was the chief of staff and the deputy chief of staff. And oh, it's not North. Sorry, yeah, Center, the head of the Central Command. In the IDF, sorry, that was my mistake. In 2008, he joined the Likud. He became the Minister for Strategic Affairs and Due Diligence. He was my boss. We've worked together for 4 years. He was the Deputy Prime Minister, member of the Cabinet, and nominated the Defense Minister late after that. We also have Amos Gilead. And by the way, with each of you, I've worked in the past, so I feel really like I'm closing a circle here. Amos Gilead was director of the, he was the IDF spokesman, director of the Institute of Policy and Strategy at the IDC Herzliya. This was, and formerly the director for political and military affairs at the Ministry of Defense. He's now working at the IDC, as I said, and he's the chairman of the Herzliya Convention. And they'll never manage to get a wonderful panel such as this at the Herzliya Convention, believe me. Anyway. Well, that's because Amos can't be part of it. Exactly, you're quite right. We have Major General retired Yaakov Amidol, Senior Fellow. He's used to be the former National Security Advisor. He was in the IDF until 2002, head of research, the military secretary, and head of military training. He now works with various startups on cyber in the Jerusalem Institute and many other institutes in the States and in Israel. And last but not least, the head of the Mossad, previous former head of the Mossad, Tamir Pardo, between 2011 and 2016. He started in 1971 in the elite unit in IDF, then moved to the Mossad, and he served on various operational posts. He was the deputy head of the Mossad and then head of the Mossad. And when he retired from the Mossad, he started to work on various projects related to cyber. So this is quite an exceptional gang that we have here on stage. And since you haven't been here from this morning, let me tell you just a little bit about each of the panels and what was the main message in each of the panels so that you can feel as if you were here all day long. The first panel was about the Iranian internal or domestic theater. The message was that the sanctions and economic pressure will not bring about the collapse of the regime, and the secret or the hidden hope that continued pressure on Iran may bring about the change of the regime will not work.
יסתדרו, אני אדבר בכל רם, יש לי קול שבסדר. תכף יסתדרו את זה, נראה לי שזה עכשיו עובד, כן.
The second panel was on the Syrian question. We all know what is happening on the Syrian question. It also dealt with Iran, with Russia, and with Syria, and of course Israel facing all these questions. And here I would like to say to mention two main things that were mentioned in the panels. First, that most panelists feel that there's not going to be a war between Iran and Israel in Syria. That may sound optimistic to you. And secondly, it is not the things that are not likely to happen in the foreseeable future in Syria are an exit of the Iranians, an exit of the Russians, or a deepening of the American involvement. And in the last panel that just ended on the scenarios for the coming year on the nuclear deal, well, the most likely scenario, according to all panelists, was that Iran does not have any interest in pulling out of the agreement, and which is why we don't expect a major change in its behavior, and it's going to buy more time. The question was raised of the green light, red light to an Israeli attack or strike in Iran. And in this room we have two people who were deeply involved in the processes on the American side. We have former Ambassador Dan Shapiro and Norman Rule. I don't see him. Oh, there he is. Okay. And I would say that both of them agreed that during the Obama administration, Israel had a red light, although it was quite clear that it was sovereign to make any decision it liked. And the question was to what extent that the Trump administration would give Israel the green light, and all of them believed that Trump did not want to attack in Iran himself. The last question related to the likelihood of a renewed negotiation between the US and Iran. Well, they all estimated that the likelihood was slim. So, this is a recap of the previous panels, and now I would like each of you to please tell us what they think. Where do we stand today with regards to these issues? Where are we today facing Iran? And then we will hold a few additional rounds of questions from here and from the audience. Thank you. I think that if we did a biographical program of each of the panelists, we will all be invited as guests because we all have worked in the past together, and usually the most important question we have been dealing with, and which we will be dealing with in the foreseeable future, is Iran. I would like to remind you that Israel does not have a border with Iran. Nobody ever claimed that Israel conquered or possessed or annexed any area that belonged to Iran, but still, after the Khomeini revolution, the Iranian regime has set Israel as a target for annihilation, which is why Iran has become, not because of Israel's choice, but it has become the bitter enemy of Israel. And in view of what happened in the last decade in the Middle East, it seems quite clear that Iran is not the only but the major factor causing instability in the area. As for the questions we're dealing with, it is quite clear that the Iranian regime is a threat not only to stability, its aspirations go much farther than that. Eventually, when you look at the agreement which Israel rightly decided that it was a bad agreement, the JCPOA, well, the bottom line is that it released Iran from diplomatic pressure before the agreement, and also it freed Iran from the economic sanctions up to the agreement. It removed from the table the military option, which was even credible at the time. It was a real option, and it also freed the Iranians from the fear that these three pressures, the diplomatic isolation, the economic sanctions, and the military sanctions, could bring about changes. We've seen some of these in the Green Revolution of 2009. There was a disappointment in the American response to that. But when I look at the Iranian regime today in terms of what Israel should do and what Israel must do, we have to remember this. In fact, the Iranian regime in 2003 decided to stop the project, to suspend it. Until when? Well, until it realized that the United States has lost its political stomach, its determination, its political ability to continue the campaign which looks to us that started in Afghanistan after 9/11 and then in Iraq. And the question which the leaders asked themselves in the Middle East, who's next? What did Gaddafi say? He removed his nuclear project without one single shot being shot, and Khamenei saw that this threat of the military option was removed because of the political pressure inside the US. And when Khamenei decided to come to the negotiation table in 2015, this was because of those four types of pressure, four outside and one inside pressure or fear. And he was willing to go quite far in what developed afterwards. And the result was that Israel, of course, was very critical about it, but the result, and this was when Trump changed his policy, not because of breaching the agreement, because as was mentioned here, Iran's interest is not to breach the agreement, although we have to be suspicious all the time, because Iran has lied so many times, we have to keep looking where it might lie again, but specifically, right now, it does not have any interest in breaking or breaching the agreement, but the economic pressure that was already exerted is related to other problems, arms proliferation, the missile project, terrorism, and human rights. As was mentioned here, the sanctions seem to be working, they're quite efficient, but there's a problem. And as for our own criticism on what the Americans did, criticism here in the Institute, there was a group of experts that sat together and provided some recommendations to President Trump. We included all the things mentioned by Trump except for withdrawing or pulling out from the agreement according to the 5+1 principle, and not with Europe, of course. But when I look forward, thinking of Israel, in order to provide a response to the challenge set by Iran, we need to be partners to the international efforts led by the US. I personally think that in some cases we went ahead of ourselves. We have to maintain a flank position or a side position or back position, but not a front position, because as long as the US administration is leading a policy that we believe is true, we have to support diplomatically and in other ways and in terms of the intelligence, but the leader of this step has to be the US. Today Israel is dealing with the Iranian proxies anyway. When you speak of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's an Iranian proxy, and Iran is building Hezbollah as a strategic proxy with 120 to 150,000 rockets and missiles. That's their main brand, so they're just waiting for the day. It's not for attrition, it's not for deterrence, it's not for dissuasion, it's just waiting for the day it will be used. Whenever it becomes the Iranian interest, Hezbollah is going to be the main element working against us, and we have to prepare for that. Deciding to go on such a war is not going to be accepted here but in Iran, so I don't see any risk of escalation on that front. It has been tested several times in the last few years. Our main the fear related to Hezbollah in Lebanon is very serious, but for now we know that a strategic arm is not used for attrition. Remember the wrath on Hezbollah when they did start something in 2006. So the second element is the Palestinian jihad, which is also an arm of Iran today, and the Hamas, of course. The Hamas, its rockets, and its military activity is not funded by Arab money, it's only funded by Iranian money. So when Israel is looking at the challenge which these branches or arms are posing, and of course when we look at Iran and its interests, well, in each theater, in each front, we have to deal with those directly and in the right way. Overall, the current policy is the right one, I think. There are two things I did not mention. First was terrorism. There's terrorism that is being pushed by Iran, supported by Iran, trying to reach, to do terror in Judea and Samaria. And in the last few months, we've seen also an Iranian threat in Syria. And on that front, I think that we are using the right policy, and the Iranians are clearly now losing, and we should continue. I would not rely on the Russians to deliver the goods. I would not rely on the Americans to deliver the goods for us. Of course, we have to coordinate. Whatever we can reach diplomatically, we should. But in the end of the day, Israel must draw its own red lines, and once anybody crosses those lines, it should use its heavy clout in order to efficiently and rightly work against that. The Iranians started to open a terroristic front in Syria in 2014 and 2015, ever since Tzuk Eitan, the protective edge operation. Ever since that, there was no single Daesh attack, only by the Revolutionary Guards. And what brought the stop in 2015 is because those three elements ceased existing. The Iranians understood that Israel has supremacy, operational and intelligence-wise, and they don't want to mess up with us in Syria. They tried to do it in February this year. That drone that crossed the Emek Bet-Shan area, and they understood that this was actually observed by the Israeli intelligence, not to mention the fact that the launcher that launched that drone was 300 kilometers to the east in the desert, and it was destroyed immediately, and all their attempts to respond or to do something deterring like rockets and so forth was responded to very strongly. Not only the launcher was destroyed, but also hundreds of Iranian targets were destroyed in Syria. So, on a cold analysis, they understand that they received a severe blow from the Israeli forces and intelligence, and if they want to continue, well, of course, they would like to continue, but I think that the state of Israel will also continue to have the same policy, according to which whenever a red line is crossed, whoever crossed the line will just be hurt. We don't have to take responsibility for every case, but this strengthens our deterrent capacities. Now, in Hebrew, if we use the tools correctly, our next campaign in Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, whatever, Daesh is going to be further away, and it's going to actually postpone the next round of violence. Israel is now facing the strengthening of Iran, because Gaza is now equipped with Iranian weapons that came through Sudan, Egypt, and Sinai, and the Gaza Strip. But that stopped. The ship that was intercepted in the Red Sea was the last attempt. They understood ever since then that we can see right through them in terms of intelligence, and also there were things that happened in Sudan and in Egypt. So ever since Iran has failed to smuggle weapons, conventional weapons into Gaza, what it is still transferring is knowledge, all kinds of ideas and documents, but they're not able of using that channel in the same way. This is also true for weapons in the north, transferring weapons to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, or trying to create manufacturing lines to manufacture precision rockets and missiles. So they're trying to actually create factories in Syria and Lebanon that would manufacture such weapons. Of course, Israel should not allow that to happen, and this should be also seen as a red line which the Iranians will not be allowed to cross. Naturally, a central question that was also mentioned today was the evaluation of Iran's nuclear capacity. Of course, JCPOA postponed the maturation of that project, but left in the hands of Iran the independent ability to build a bomb through the uranium channel. With regard to the plutonium channel, Iran was willing to relinquish that even before the start of the negotiation because they knew that they weren't advanced anymore. As far as they're concerned, they got what they wanted in the negotiation. They got exactly what they wished for. And of course, for the continuation of this process, Israel has to be well coordinated with the US. Things are working much better with this administration than with the previous one. As I said, Israel should maintain a flank position. It should share our friends with any relevant intel and maybe with other things as well. But in any event, supporting the sanctions must be one of the building blocks of the Israeli policy. And here I would also say something in terms of criticism. I think that the fact that the Europeans, mostly the Europeans, it's harder with Russia and with China, although I'd like to remind you that in 2010, Russia and China joined the UN resolution on sanctions, and to a large extent because of the Israeli influence. Netanyahu went to Moscow, I went to Beijing to convince that if it looks like a duck and swims like a duck and looks like and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck, and it's a military project. And as for the economical repercussions and all that, well, the UN resolution for June 2010 was supported, was carried unanimously, and Europe should be on board in this coping with Iran. The fact that President Trump decided to confront Europe does not do anything good to any of that. That's why we recommended here at the Institute not to pull out, not to start a front with Europe, and here Israel could play the role of a facilitator. Maybe this is beyond expectations in view of the quite extreme tones that were heard on both sides of the Atlantic, but if I should make one single recommendation, I should say that we should take advantage of the special role that the Europeans assumed as a broker in changing the current agreement. Anyway, I do believe that in a coordinated move, that when the Iranian regime will face a dilemma of survival or bomb, they will choose survival. This happened in 2003, it happened in 2012 and 2013. And if we want to do that again, the current conditions, well, in the current conditions and circumstances, we should continue the sanctions. We should try to bring the Europeans on board of the effort and not do any provocation with regard to the Europeans. And in any event, in the end of the day, I would like to remind you that the pressure on Iran was a combined effort, not only of economic pressure, but also a credible military option and a diplomatic isolation, hence the fear in Iran from internal riots and uprisings. Trying to summarize my recommendations, first, I think that Israel should not jump ahead of themselves. You know that they say that the work of the just is done by others for them. The military option should be a last resort, but it should be well prepared and well ready in order for us to be able to protect ourselves should we need to, because there's no one that can do what we need to do except for us. Thank you.
I'd like to, it's a kind of balance. I'm burdened and troubled. We spoke about the Iranian threat to the cabinet, and during that period, it was 96, there were no missiles whatsoever in Iran, and Lebanon had a symbolic number. Now it's 130 to 150,000, and I'm quoting the previous Minister of Defense. So I think that we have to talk about the fortification and the building of force and the use of force, and we're only impressed by that because a balloon that doesn't cost anything, that burns fields, well, we're impressed, but 130,000, we sort of say, that's old news. I'm worried that we didn't actually prevent that happening, and I'd like to stress the fact that what are the actual restrictions of force. Now, on the other hand, they're still trying to build the drones and the missiles and to create a threat against Israel. Yes, there are restrictions. We cannot overcome them. Yes, we do deter them, but we are also deterred. Let's be honest. Let's, say the truth. Now, if we talk about Syria, well, really, chapeau to what's happening, but we really have to be very careful. The Iranians, the Russians give us a kind of freedom of modus operandi. And why? And I don't want to talk about what exactly the Americans' policy is. But will the Americans actually prevent the establishment of the Iranians in Syria? I doubt it. I mean, I do not doubt. I mean, I do not have a doubt about it, basically. But the day will come. Russia is a bit like the USSR. You can see that in the history. I do not believe that over time, Assad is kind of sort of a straw leader. But the time will come and we will hear an ultimatum from the Russians about air defense and other issues. Because this is a kind of interim period, and after all, Russia does work with us and coordinates with us based on their vested interests, but they're not our friend. But Iran is more of a strategic partner, and we're a kind of, let's call it, a kind of coordinated friend, quote unquote. I think this is a sort of unlimited period of time, or at least it is limited, borrowed time, one can even say, with the Russians. But ostensibly, they say that they said that we have attacked in Syria, but of course this has not been officially confirmed, but there's so many official sources that maybe I'm starting to believe it myself. But there are restrictions in everything that I've been saying. Now, vis-a-vis Iraq, perhaps a small miracle will take place. He will be re-elected. After all, that's Iraqi democracy, because the Iranians want to create an empire, and we want to prevent that happening. You can see the presence of the Americans in Tanaf, and we're happy that they're not actually vacating their forces from there, and they're remaining there for the moment. Now, vis-a-vis nuclear capabilities, the Iranians have an enormous amount of missiles, of course. Israel does have a force of deterrence, so we're happy about that. But I remember in talks with the United States at the end of the 90s, one of the arguments was about North Korea. Will North Korea be nuclear or not? Well, after all, they did reach an agreement, and they said, they reached an agreement, and they even dismantled the military reactor. But they built it covertly in Syria in a brilliant step. Who was Syria at the time? Dr. Bashir Assad spoke about a strategic balance of a state that was basically the whole country was the size of a town in the West. But someone helped them, They said the main contribution was that the North Koreans and others helped them build it, and no one intervened. So the lesson that I have learned from that is President Trump can declare that North Korea is someone that they can have a dialogue with. But the topic, the lesson is that Iran will also not demilitarize itself and disarm itself. And so I just remind you, we've got Pakistan, who's a kind of predator friend, but they could perhaps collaborate. They've got various warheads, and I believe that there will be all sorts of collaborations the more time passes. But I think that what frustrates me with the actual pulling out of the agreement, and they've got a tremendous influence on Iran, but unfortunately they're not leading the Western world anymore nowadays. So, I mean, we have to look at everything. So now, there were those who said and really made a lot of money about the collapse of the Iranian regime. I wasn't one of those. Well, such a regime doesn't become sort of topple so quickly. For example, even Venezuela, when the CNN keeps saying that they're going to sort of collapse, I can't see that happening so quickly. I mean, really, people think that things collapse. There's so many dimensions of various military people and belligerent people, etc. Unfortunately, you know, these things, I wouldn't actually, I don't think this is the Besiege or anyone else who's really actually fighting all this, although they've got a water crisis, there's terrible corruption, but I still can't see them actually collapsing. They've got sources of power that are so amazing that we really would be very surprised to see it, believe me. I came to the conclusion that Israel cannot actually topple regimes. Maybe Putin can. Putin can say, listen, he said to the actual, the Prime Minister of Chechnya, believe me, I'm going to destroy your capital and you'll see how it happens within a minute. But we can't do that. I think that the Iranian regime is our strategic threat and it's an existential threat, and they're not going to disappear. Now, what threat have they created? If the assessment is correct, that is somewhat dismal. I mean, I'll tell you how I see things in Syria. We have to be very tactical and operative, but strategically we haven't succeeded in persuading them to stop building their capability. How can we bring about a situation wherein we can persuade them to stop building their force? That is something that they're actually charmed by our capabilities, but it doesn't disturb them. They believe in their path. They want a second front. They succeeded in their first front, which is Lebanon. Now they want the second one, and now after that they'll be able to build their nuclear capabilities. So I think that they're not going to change their agenda nor their schedule. What can we do? What are the cards that we have? First of all, the partnership with the United States. Bogie described that beautifully. The Americans are our only friend for the sake of historic justice, although I didn't like that actually agreement when it was signed on. All of them have been, all the administrations have been our closest friends and allies. They are our main asset, whether I liked it or not, they are our friends. Another asset is the Western world, but there's a restriction to that. First of all, we've got an achievement because our strategic security ties were really something that we didn't believe would possibly happen. We actually really did make an enormous effort, and of course the IDF included, and that gives us really force multipliers. And that is that those are the Arab countries, if we're talking about Egypt and Jordan. And with the Arabs, you can actually do things with, but one thing you cannot, and that is that the Saudi Arabian army, Air Force, and the Israeli Air Force actually attacking together in Yemen. No, that won't happen. I do trust in that friendship that is developed with them, and that is a very important issue. But to actually fight together with them, I doubt if that will happen. I'm troubled that in this twilight zone wherein Abu Mazen will come, who thought that at some point he was eternal, and that's what the intel said. Unfortunately, I do think that it may be eternal, but it's dependent on time. In other words, it's limited. He's 83, and he's going to basically collapse. I think that the Hamas will go, and they will create, they want a vacuum to be created, and they will try and penetrate and fill that vacuum in Judea and Samaria. I think that the Gaza Strip, we found some kind of solution, but I'm really worried about the force that will be backed by the Iranians, and that's very problematic. But in the meantime, we still have the upper hand. So everything that I have mentioned are not fixed. I mean, you can't actually really sort of rely on them totally blindly. I mean, you need to really work on these the whole time and force and make sure that this remains. So ultimately, the Iranian threat is our central threat. It still is. I won't go into the details of it, but I think it's pretty clear to everyone that's sitting here. But I think that ultimately, if we don't find a way of meeting the sort of finding a response, the sanctions are not going to actually solve the problems. They will cause a tremendous burden on them, but we still need to have a military option on the table, and all cooperations and collaborations with the United States are extremely important, but we do want to prevent a second front being created in Syria. And the nuclear, well, they're definitely striving to attain that capability. And other things, North Korea and the dialogue between them and the Americans, I think it has to be extremely vehement and has to continue, of course. Thank you very much. I think that all of you understood that this is an open audience, but I still, by the way, this is a completely open panel, and it's on record and it's not off record. And so everything is open. I would like to open with an apology, because the moment this ends, I've got to go to a very positive family event, and that is I have had little twin girl granddaughters that were just born, so we're going to our ceremony. So don't be confused. They're not my daughters, they're granddaughters, especially if this is on record and not off record. A long time ago, I discussed this panel with me, and I sort of someone wanted, so I wrote quite a lot down, and it's there. You'll find it on the site. It's a 5,000-word essay where I spoke about the Iranians from every angle possible. So you can look at it on site. So what I'm going to do are simply my comments rather than the entire template that I wrote and that you can read. We had a mission. We had to stop Iran in its nuclear program, and we managed to sort of really make time, but we didn't succeed in stopping it. We didn't succeed. We did actually make at least 25 years, perhaps. I mean, it was 1994. We really worked on it. 1995, we brought it to the Americans, who said that it doesn't exist, and then they did manage to succeed a year later. And since then, we have been toiling and troubling to bring around a situation wherein the Iranians would think it's not worthwhile for them to develop it, but we didn't succeed in doing that. The Iranians, in earnest, truly in earnest, wanted to achieve it, more so than we even thought from a technical point of view, in creating a nuclear capability, a military nuclear capability for themselves. I'm only talking about that, military capabilities. True that with our cooperation with the Americans, we created international pressure wherein the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russian were with us on it, and we're not going to go on a stroll down memory lane how we did it. But I think one of those were our greatest diplomatic sort of endeavors that were successful, and with the Americans at the negotiation paper, the Iranians moved to an abolishment of their capabilities. Now, why did it happen in the States? In other words, a kind of an American surrender to the Iranian demands to develop their capabilities. So, I mean, if the Iranians can do it, then others basically said the same. It was a very embarrassing actually surrender to an illogical a real demand of the Iranians that should not have been accepted at the time. Even the Europeans were surprised by this American surrender in those days. And I think that most of the experts said they will, yes, they will remain in that agreement, because why should they leave it? It's a really good one. But anyway, we won't go back to that history and start going into the nitty-gritty. But the Iranians did not give up their desire because of the JCPOA, because at the end of it they will be in a better position. Their centrifuges will be much faster, their missiles will have longer ranges, and their entire economic system will be stronger. And that is now, perhaps because of the sanctions, it won't be as well done and as fast and as strong. But I believe that they will come out with an upper hand, so therefore they will remain in it. And although the Americans have pulled out, you would have thought that the Iranians wouldn't want to know, but they will come out with an upper hand out of it. So why should they actually want to take a step back from it? But what is our problem with it? But the Iranians are active the whole time in Yemen, in Lebanon. And why is it so urgent now for us? Because they're also very active in Syria. They want an independent Iranian military machine to be built by them. They don't want to be dependent on the Russians or on anyone else. They themselves want to determine when that war machine will be operated, when they want to operate it. And that is connected to their entire nuclear worldview. The Iranians want to create a Korean situation wherein, in the state of Israel, no leader will be able to come and make a decision to actually wipe out the Iranian nuclear capabilities, because they start saying that because they know that we can see this war machine in Syria and the 130,000 missiles in Lebanon. It's because they wanted to create a Korean situation. Why should we call it a Korean situation? South Korea doesn't want to actually take a risk of actually attacking them because they don't know how things will end in Seoul. So therefore, I don't know if there's going to be a war in Syria against the Iranians or not. I don't know. But what I do think... The question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we ready to take all those steps that might escalate to a war? We have to make a decision, a strategic strategic one, that we will do everything possible, even if the result will be a war against Iran, which will be the worst possible one, which will include a war against the Hezbollah and their 120,000 missiles as well. So I don't know how to answer whether there will be a war or not, but I do know but I can say that we should do everything possible, even if in the end there might be a war. We have to do everything to secure ourselves. I think that all in all, the steps that have been taken up to now, and I know them really from their initial stages, perhaps a little less now, a little less updated now, I think that the decision was a matter of principle, and we should not forget it. The question is not whether we should attack, the nuclear facility there or not. They're not going to continue developing that capability for the moment. The Americans were not surprised, by the way, that we didn't attack there, because we explained what our schedule was, and we told them when we would and when we wouldn't, and they weren't surprised that it didn't happen because they helped us delay that and postpone it. So, despite what is written in various books, it was clarified unequivocally. And the same here. It ought to be clear that in Iran and in Moscow and in Washington, that we are really ready and willing to go to war with Syria, and it'll be a horrific war, because we're talking about such a plethora of missiles that will actually be able to hit every single part of Israel. But those missiles will not rust over. And that maybe is a little sort of jab at Bogie, because they will use them, because that is their strategic weapon. And if they feel that they are being cornered in Syria, they won't be frightened to actually activate the Hezbollah with their missiles. They're not worried about it, however much they will be hit. So if we decide to go the whole hog from building that war machine that they want to build.
And 3 comments on things that are important, but that I wanted to mention here. 4 things, actually. First, unlike others, I think that the economic pressure, if the Iranians feel that the Europeans have joined this and that it's really capturing them, that they can't get out of it, maybe this will bring them to a second thought on trying to come into negotiations and improve their position. Because in 2012, all the experts explained us that the Iranians will never negotiate, and here the Obama administration went the extra mile to really bring them to the negotiation table. And this should be accompanied by a very clear statement, a military statement. Before Obama, the US had no capability of dismantling the Iranian nuclear capacities. And when he asked his people, how can we do it? They said, we can't. They said, we have to. And then they created that. And the Iranian knew that. So, even Dan agrees with me. When it comes to truth, even Dan agrees with me. Anyway, and I'm saying this because one goes with the other. And if they don't feel that the option is on the table, then I must say, in the internal discussions, I was the one who said, I was one of those who were surprised by the change in the American attitude in submitting to the Iranian demands. And I'm saying this because it is also going to be true in the future. The economic pressure is critical, but it's not enough. It can't do the job on its own. The second point is the coordination with Russia. The maximum I can say about that is that it's a very, 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 and if I had another very, I would say very subtle and complex stance. You can't discuss this in public. You can't say everything that's true about it. It's unbelievably complex and complicated. It didn't start today. It was created gradually. It's like a tango. A little bit forward, a little bit backward. It's extremely complex. So far, it's working. Is there anything that's set in stone here? I don't know. Why is it working? I think that it's working because we're doing things right and we're not destroying what shouldn't be destroyed. And, we're doing what has to be done and we're not doing what should not be done. And it's very difficult to explain that, much less in public. As for the coordination with the United States, well, I would say that, carefully, our coordination in terms of intelligence with the US has reached amazing peaks in the previous administration. But that's not the problem. The problem is not to coordinate about intelligence and to know that we agree and even to do things together sometimes. That's not where the problem is. The problem is what is the best or the supreme interest of each side and to what extent that side is willing to pay for that interest. And here there's a big difference when you look at the Middle East from Washington or when you look at the Middle East from Jerusalem. Geography matters. And it leads quite naturally different parties to look at reality from different angles and to look at it differently. And that will also be something complex, complicated, and will depend on the people who are at the head of the administration. But one thing will not change. The angle of vision from Jerusalem is different from that one can find from Washington. And this reminds me of a story, a very old story about Korea. The first time the Iranians came to Korea, they wanted to buy long-range missiles. This was a long time ago. They wanted long-range missiles, so the Koreans told them, no problem, we have a shelf here, and we have missiles for 1,000 kilometers. Take as many as you like. This is the price. Take whatever you like. So the Iranians said, what's the range? And they said 1,000 kilometers. So the Iranians said, let us check, and they returned 2 days later and said, if it's not 1,300, we don't buy. So everybody went to the maps and wanted to see what was the meaning of those 300 kilometers. So the answer is the western borders of Iran are 1,200 kilometers from the easternmost border of Israel. So if there was anybody who had doubts about why they wanted those 300 kilometers, well, now we know that maybe not the only, but probably one of the goals of these missiles were to reach Israel. It's true that for now they're launching at Saudi Arabia, not in Israel, but still. And this is connected, there's a connection between what's happening between the US and Iran and the US and Korea and the Middle East. Of course, the relation is complex, but it exists. And the more the Americans succeed with the North Koreans, and I share some of Amos's pessimism. It's not hard because Amos is always a pessimistic, but I share some of his pessimism. And a pessimist in the Middle East is an optimist with a lot of experience. So anyway, I'm pessimistic with regard to the ability, but we should not cease trying, and we have to understand that we're talking about regimes who are willing to pay very high, very dear prices to get those capacities, and we have to be willing to do extreme things to prevent them from acquiring nuclear capabilities. I don't know about the United States. I don't want to give advice to the Americans, but I think that we must be prepared to bear the brunt of these extreme possibilities should we be put in that corner. It's as simple as that. Well, good evening. Almost good evening. Naturally, I see things a little bit differently. That's why we brought you. Yes, I know. I know. I'm always counting on you, Amos. Anyway, since 2000, we have been finding ourselves in a new strategic situation. It has been justly mentioned here that Israel has no border with Iran. 1,290 kilometers from our eastern border to their western border. But ever since the beginning of the 21st century, they do have a border with us, and that's quite dramatic because they have the Iranian capacities and capabilities, first through the Hezbollah as it develops, which is a stone's throw away from the Israeli population centers. And the rockets that we can, and the same rocket, if it is sent from us, does not come even close to the Iranian border, and that fact has extreme significance. I'm not even sure to what extent people have understood the significance of this difference, that on the one hand there's a threat a big threat, which has a border with us, but we don't have a border with it. As for the nuclear questions, and I'll wrap up everything afterwards. Nuclear, well, that's a political decision. The Iranian regime that opted for developing to acquire nuclear capacity, that's a political decision, and discontinuing this effort is going to be also a political decision. Or, in other words, there are three real alternatives to stop the nuclear project. The first is to put the Star-Spangled Banner in Iran. That doesn't seem to be applicable, never was, never will be, and it's not justified. So nobody will pay the price for a country that's as large as half of Europe, and much less after the Iraqi experiment or experience. Also, another possibility is that that regime should come to the conclusion that it's too expensive, too costly to deal with this in terms of the economy and society and in terms of power. But in the end, it's a political decision, not a 1-ton or 10-ton bomb or any punctual no single military operation will really stop the project. That we have to understand that. The third option is replacing the regime, and the hope that the next regime is going to be better. But that's something you only know after it's done, and we can't just decide, let's change a regime and make sure that you do it, and much less when you do it from the outside. And replacing a regime has, well, the analogy I always give is if you take a vase made of crystal, if there's one point where you actually just touch it and it turns into powder. And where is that point? Nobody knows. In a certain constellation, you reach that point suddenly, unexpectedly, not through outside pressure, but through a combination of inner and outer pressure, and all of a sudden everything falls to dust. But no one can predict when this happens. In Iran, it could happen tomorrow morning or in 50 years. And there's no clear connection with economic sanctions. And there's no also clear connection between the intensity of the sanctions and the replacement of the regime, although of course sanctions help. As for the agreement, with a regime such as the Iranian regime, no agreement is a good agreement. It's very simple. We have to understand that once and for all. Even if tomorrow morning Trump signs an agreement, and if he's not an active member to the drafting of the agreement, everyone who was not part of drafting the agreement will say that, excuse my French, this was crap. So saying about the negotiator that they should have and could have reached a better agreement, I mean, come on. Go to any negotiation at any level. Those who did not participate always say that the agreement achieved by others is a bad agreement and that he could have managed to reach a better agreement. Everybody says that all the time, because in life, an agreement a good agreement is one when both sides make concessions. There is no agreement where one party gets everything and the other party gets nothing. In such an agreement, the amount of concessions is such that everyone feels that they could make less concessions and reach more. But, any agreement with Iran, even if we have the ultimate agreement that nobody knows who's going to read it, I don't believe this Iranian regime regarding any agreement, and that's the basic point. That's the, in the previous agreement, that was the basic belief that my American friends had, And we had that same belief as well, or lack of disbelief. And even if there's an amazing, fantastic agreement signed in 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, whatever, I recommend all the intelligence services and all the states and countries that as long as this regime exists, and even after or during the next regime, make very careful choices to make sure that you know what these guys are doing, because I do not believe them. And the strength of an agreement relies on the prices set for what happens when the agreement is breached and when things that shouldn't be done are done. And then you reach a point where you can say you breached the agreement, and then you have sanctions. You can exert this or that type of power, including military power if necessary, to bring them back to order. But very often, political or other powers are sufficient. You don't need to resort to military power. I don't want to go into the whole question of how we got to sign on this particular agreement. I have my own version of things. I'll just say one thing. We tried to bring along another wait of maybe 18 months with more sanctions, which was great sanctions, and only then reach negotiate the table. I don't want to divulge anything. I don't want to say why the timing was set the way it was and why we didn't manage to wait more. But the bottom line, I already mentioned, that's it. But interestingly, this is what I refer to as the Iranian luck, because Iran used to be a pariah. Nobody spoke to that country. Nobody had formal connections or collaborations, although lots of countries tried to do this. And the Americans, with a lot of talent and a lot of might, managed to block anywhere where they found that someone was trying to override or to escape the sanctions. But what happened was Daesh, and Daesh reached the peak of its power when the agreement was signed. And as a result of the fact that Western countries, and justly so, I must say that, if I'm not willing to send my soldiers, why should they send their soldiers thousands of kilometers away from their countries? Daesh was at the peak of its power, and no one was willing to put some boots on the ground. Everyone was willing to do airstrikes and to train forces of partisans, this or that, but to put real boots on the ground and full military clout, nobody was willing to do that, except for the Iranians. The Iranians were willing to take their troops and other troops that they recruited in the form of different militias and to fight, even if not officially as a coalition, but side by side. In Iraq, and in the campaign to liberate Mosul, it was won thanks to the militias recruited by Qasem Soleimani, and the defeat of defeating Daesh in Syria was greatly done thanks to Hezbollah and the Shiites, who put some boots not only on the ground but in the mud and did the tough part of the work, because airstrikes are easy. And they did that. They did that not because they wanted to help the West. They did that because they believe, basically, fundamentally, that they want to reach dominance in the Middle East because of their historic philosophy, which is, this is not the time to talk about that now. But we were lucky enough that we could give them license to go into Iraq and go into Syria, almost with a formal invitation by the Western countries, not something that was admitted, of course, out loud, but because the seriousness of the threat by Daesh required someone to do the legwork. And for them, it was a reward. And they took advantage of this reward to the fullest, and unfortunately, we see the results in our northern borders today. This was done in cooperation side by side. They had a common interest. The world works on common interest, and they had a common interest. And the big devil or the small devil, the Iranians were very happy that the airstrikes on Mosul were done by the American army, who helped the Iranian ground forces. You don't have to speak, you don't have to coordinate. No, you don't have to sit in the same room to do that. But the interest was that, because the interest was derived out of Daesh's power. And we were also watching this, and we were enjoying seeing how Daesh was being pushed aside. And then when I look at the picture the way I'm drawing it now, I would like to say, and I have a bit of self-criticism here about us, because we're part of the Israeli might. I've been part of the Israeli side for more than 40 years, and unfortunately, I'm really sad to say that Israel is still stuck with the Ben Gurion doctrine, even today. And Ben Gurion's doctrine is that of power. It's a doctrine according to which I use power based on a logic that says that this will help me postpone the next time I have to resort to power. Unlike all the other models of using power along the human history, that power is supposed to help you reach a political or diplomatic goal. In the end, you use power to reach a political achievement. Conquering a state is also a political achievement. You can reach your goal by using political means or military means, but according to the Israeli perception, ever since Israel was founded, the whole idea was that there will always be a military conflict. And this is how the doctrine was developed, according to which Israel does not have a policy. It only has a power policy. Power is not intended to initiate political or diplomatic connections, because there was no one to speak to when we founded the country. So the whole rationale was that we're going to use power just so that it takes the other side more time to recover, and then it will take us more time until we reach the point where we have to resort to more power. But this ended in 1977 in reality, but we still have it in our DNA. There was peace with Egypt, cold, hot, whatever, but it's peace. It's a strategic peace that withheld so many obstacles. If someone wrote in 1977 that this peace would survive the chaos that was here in the last decade, no one would have believed, no one would have signed that there's a 1 to 1,000 chance that this peace would survive. And it did. And more things were created, more agreements and more understandings, which are unprecedented, even not in our imagination. And the story with Jordan is the same, without going in details. So the basic model that power or military might is the only possible model, that model collapsed. It even collapsed with Syria. We didn't reach an agreement with Syria, but there was a negotiation, which was completely contradictory to what Ben Gurion had believed, because the reality changed since Ben Gurion, but we didn't. And you can hear that all the time. Which brings me to say, yes, Iran is a threat. Today, it's much a bigger threat than it used to be, say 5 years ago or 4 years ago. Because Iran managed to build itself an extension in Lebanon, and it's now trying to create another extension in a more subtle way, and in the long term this could even pose a bigger problem to us. And now we're not looking only at Syria, because we also have to look at Iraq, because the Iraqi story is still an unfinished one. And putting missiles in the H line or in Iraq, they can reach us easily. So the Iraqi game is strongly influenced today by the Iranians, and this particular type of range does not make our lives easier. So our supreme interest today, I think, is related to the conventional weapons, because and this will also have an influence on the non-conventional aspect. And if you ask us where the weakness is, paradoxically speaking, this is where the weakness is, Lebanon. Because in Lebanon there's a mutation that has not been seen anywhere else in the world. You have a sub-state organization that has the military might, which is much bigger and larger than the state in which it stays. It's a state where there's an embassy of the US and France and UK. And in 2006, we have here the head of the intelligence corps at the time, when the idea came up that Tzahal would say, okay, we're going to strike the Lebanese to calm down the Hezbollah. Some friends, countries came to us and told us, you guys can deal with Hezbollah, but leave Lebanon alone. And when the head of the intelligence corps said, I'm going to close down their airport in half an hour, and that harbor, I'm going to destroy it so that it takes them 2 years to rebuild it, they said, no, you deal only with Hezbollah, you leave Lebanon alone. Because it was Hezbollah. And we felt that, the Lebanese should sleep calmly. So if the United States had imposed sanctions, even verbally, what Mr. Trump did to Iran, if they had said, dear Lebanon, you have 45 days to comply, and you have two alternatives, either Hezbollah, because they're in the parliament and in the government, either they become part of Lebanon, and then you have the southern front and the home front and the strategic front and so forth, and then you have one army and all that, and this is one alternative. The other alternative is go back to Tehran, and you can choose, but choose one. And sanctions started to work within 45 days. Then Lebanon, if this had happened, well, even if only 1/1000th of the sanctions now being used against Iran had been imposed onto Lebanon, this would have brought Lebanon to the point of decision. 1/1000th of the sanctions that we now see. Because everybody knows that if there's a war there, it will not be a war between Hezbollah and Israel, but between Hezbollah and Lebanon. And Israel has to make this clear, that Lebanon will be completely destroyed should one rocket fly and fall on a population center in Israel. And yes, it was mentioned here that the price will be dear. Yes, but this can be prevented. That's what I'm saying. It can be prevented because if we reach the situation through political and diplomatic moves such as were done in the last few years, this really takes the carpet off the Iranians' feet, because it's about Hezbollah, and if Hezbollah changes the way it exists in Lebanon, this will change entirely the game in Syria and also in Iraq, because other rules will have been set. So what Tzahal is doing in Syria is necessary, and it's very, very true, and is done very intelligently and wisely, but that doesn't bring the solution yet. The solution is not going to be reached by using more power, but by using power in a way that will lead to political moves. Israel uses power very intelligently and wisely, but the last bit of the phrase just does not exist. I would recommend to reconsider terms that we use, that we've been using in the last years, such as deterrence, or decision or decisiveness. These terms have changed because the world of war has changed to a great extent. What was true 5, 10, 15 years ago is not true anymore. The use of these terms, I think, leads to mistakes in perception, and these mistakes in perception bring about mistakes in the use of power. And this is a time of revolution, not here, but a global revolution. Everything is changing. It's like a global village going through a revolution. And if I asked someone who knows a little bit about history, and I asked them in 1791, 2 years after the French Revolution, if you sat in a cafe and asked about what's going to happen tomorrow, nobody would have predicted Napoleon. Nobody would have predicted how the world would get organized in a few years. So there's many reasons that brought us to what we're going through today. So the way we behave today as a state of Israel in this global village is highly influenced by what's happening everywhere, all over the planet. And the ability to predict processes is much more complex. I'm not sure that we're dealing with this right. Some of us are still dealing with the new world the same way we did with the old world. And the only country that ever actually tried to work with the future is the US. But today, even a small country has to look at the entire globe, the entire planet. So far, only the US looked at that, but today we have to look at the whole planet as well.
We have another 10 minutes left for this panel, so therefore I won't open it to the audience, but I'd just like to enable each of the participants of the panel to either relate to what was said by other members of the panel or something that they didn't have a chance to say beforehand. But I would like just one thing, if you could relate while you're talking inter alia, to whether it's possible to perhaps look, or whether it's feasible to look for additional ways of discourse and dialogue with Iran. If you can think of any additional option that isn't more attacks and more attacks and more attacks, etc. Although I agree that yes, in various circumstances, that is what is crucial and necessary. I mean, there's no other way. But if you could maybe think of some kind of option and just add it. Okay. Well, first of all, just a little sort of marginal footnote here. When I was talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, that we should let the missiles rust and decide, I wanted to let them actually rust over, which was actually a very positive policy at the time of Sharon, because in 2003, 4, 5, it really did actually. They did actually decrease the provocation in the south, and there was also various anti-aircraft things that were actually happening at that time in Mount Dov and other things. But we wanted the Hezbollah to be on the terror list. We wanted to persuade the Europeans and Ron Prosor at the time, and people from the intelligence directorate went to the various capitals, and they did actually around the world, and they did actually succeed partially, but the pressure started actually in Lebanon. Who are the Hezbollah serving? Is it the Palestinians? Is it the Lebanese, or whatever it was? In other words, that was a very active policy at the time, and so therefore I just wanted to make that comment, because someone commented here about me talking about a passive policy of letting the missiles rust. No, it was an active policy at the time. Now, I just wanted to say that when we go into a state of negotiations about actually using force, you can see that in history there was always a side that surrendered and there was a side that won. Also in the Second World War, we can see that with us as well. Hamas, for example, in Protective Edge, when the Egyptians suggested a ceasefire a week after we were fighting, we were willing to accept it, and the Hamas wanted 7 prerequisites to be able to agree to that, and then 50 days later they didn't even have one achievement, and they were begging for a ceasefire. And that's what explains 5, perhaps 4 years nearly of a lull and quiet. So if we're talking about decisive campaigns, etc., I think that when you talk about decisive campaigns nowadays, whether it's against Hezbollah or Hamas or even against the Iranians, because should anything develop even in Syria, if we talk about how can you bring about people to actually agree to a hudna, to a ceasefire. So I think that you can have a look at, in various campaigns like that, this kind of yearning for a slogan, let the IDF sort of win and let it be like in the days of the Six-Day War. Unfortunately, things have to be very, very clear, but much more humble, because to bring them to want a ceasefire according to your conditions, it's something that we are capable of doing, and we have done, and that's what we have to do we will do and have to in the future. I think that to come and say that one can understand the American policy wherein they relate to Iran as part of the solution and not as the whole problem, because the Iranians were willing to fight against ISIS and Daesh. I mean, I said it actually real time. I'm not saying it in hindsight. The Americans have to have a grand strategy. Look at the priorities. The Iranian threat are much more significant than Daesh. Everyone was willing to fight against ISIS, the Kurds, when you decided to help them. So why not help the Sunnis that aren't jihadists? And why build based on sort of Iran? So, for example, whichever Sunni regimes existed felt that they were neglected at the time, that they'd been abandoned by the Americans. What happened in Egypt, for example. And the Americans are actually going with the Iranians rather than the Sunnis. I think we could have actually forget Qasem Soleimani in Mosul. And I think that really, because they were fighting for their lives. And yes, I think that, there were those who did decide to help them, and everything changed. So I'm not saying it only in hindsight. I think it was a mistake to turn Iran into something that is part of the solution, wherein it is actually the main part of the problem, Iran, and Iran will become that in the future too. The other issue is, I think that there was a statement that I think was erroneous, that people said that we don't have a concept, we simply want to use force. No, that's erroneous. It means that the Iranians in war with us know that we use force. Well, Iran declared war against us the moment there was the actually Islamic revolution, and they want to eradicate us from the map. So what are you going to do when the situation exists? So can you reach through various political channels? Can you reach some kind of peace? I think they'd only be willing to deliberate about the character of the State of Israel. Do you think so? Is that a subject for negotiations? I mean, there's such enormous gaps between our capability to mediate, and it wasn't like that with Egypt or with Jordan. Jordan, by the way, were the first who were willing to actually have a strategic ties with us, and that was since 1970. It's true with Hamas and with Iran. These are ideologies that we cannot actually, that do not want to exist, to accept us as a state of the Jewish people. So what can we do? Yes, we want to try and find all sorts of channels, but yes, we have to use force. And yes, that is a kind of concept. That is the Jabotinsky and Mapai's iron wall kind of concept and ideology. It'll take a long time until we can persuade our enemies that we are here ad infinitum. So we have to use force in order to distance ourselves from the next round or campaign or war. Now, another issue is the world order. I think that the vested interest of Israel, of the states, of Europe and Russia is that we should not enable Iran, countries like that, to activate and operate terrorists and to use terrorists, for example, to take control over Lebanon. Basically, it's been hijacked. So if we're talking about diplomacy, that it should be a kind of diplomacy that pushes into a corner those regimes and countries that endanger and are treacherous to the idea of world order. Lebanon, for example, what's happened there. So that is the whole idea of a sovereign country. Now, the last issue that I would like to bring up here. The concept and Israeli strategy not to enable military nuclear capabilities in the hands of someone who is perceived as our enemy is the correct way things should be done and will be true in the future too. We should not confuse ourselves, even if there is an Iranian threat. Well, the strategic intention should be, of course, that we have to make sure whatever happens anywhere else, Iran should never have nuclear capabilities. We have to ensure that. We've got 5-6 minutes. Okay, so 2 sentences. One is important, one a little less. The important sentence is that we're not going to arrange any kind of sort of political settlement with this religious radical regime. We cannot reach an agreement with them, with the Iranian regime. And we have to try and prevent, first of all, nuclear capabilities. And if we don't succeed in Syria, we won't succeed anywhere else. I'd also like to say something about the destruction of Lebanon. What, we're going to destroy the Christian area, the Druze areas, the Sunnis, Beirut, the various quarters that are not relevant for the Hezbollah. Our only enemy in Lebanon is Hezbollah, and they're the ones who ought to be destroyed. The fact that now the president of Lebanon has become a little rag doll in the hands of Hezbollah, that doesn't mean that we're going to actually destroy Lebanon because of that. But if we do that, then of course we'll be entrenched in a quagmire. So of course we're not going to do that. I think that there is a terrible mistake vis-à-vis Lebanon. Amos started by saying that I want the war to end in Lebanon. Anything that is not Hezbollah, the glass there has not broken around it. Everyone knows that the moment that a minister of director will give a command to the airport to destroy anything in the Middle East, we will do it, because that's the way it is. It doesn't matter how long we have to prepare for it. There's no doubt about our capability, but that is not where our force is embedded. What we're saying is the moment the war ends there, we're going to make sure that everything will be safe there except the Hezbollah. Do you think that the Christians, the Moran, are enjoying the Hezbollah's force there, or the president, or anyone else, or the Druze? You think, no one will want the Iranians to be there. You know, it's like saying if we pressurize Gaza, then the Hamas will go home. They're not capable of actually evicting the Iranians, not by force, not by persuasion or by economies. The only way that we'll be able to extract them from there is with a lot of bloodshed. But we will be happy if we can actually only hit out at the Hezbollah, because so we say no one will want to destroy all of Lebanon. We'll only destroy Hezbollah targets. And that has to be to literally raise the ground that the Hezbollah is on. But we can show that we can use our force with logic, and that is part of our power. People understand that we're not only strong, we're also a little wise as well, and therefore we have to be very careful when we talk in slogans exactly. No one will do anything just because we're capable of it. We have to retain and maintain our force and preserve it. What can we do? Hezbollah is the Iranian proxy in Lebanon. Iran ultimately has a lot of force, but its nails at the moment that they are using is the Hezbollah. And so therefore we have to focus on the Hezbollah only when we are attacking. And the same with the Iranians in Syria. Only focus on the Iranians. And so we don't need to do other things at the well. We only have to deal with Iranians with all our force. Okay. So if we have to hit out at those who want to actually eradicate us, that's a different thing. We shouldn't actually deploy our force to something where the advantage is really marginal and somewhat detrimental as well. I'd like to share a statement here. I see no real option for negotiations with the Iranians. I would be happy if I could see that kind of little opening, but I don't think that it does exist. I'd like to add, though, here that I don't think the Hezbollah will choose to go back to Iran. I mean, I would love that, but I think that a state that is willing to accept with an agreement that 120 or 130,000 missiles are there in some kind of guerrilla sort of sub-state there, and yet they can still enjoy banking, economy, trade, with an understanding that if a war takes place tomorrow, they will remain actually whole after the 120,000 missiles have hit every town in the state of Israel is unacceptable. And please, you can... But, I mean, and Ra'anana is one of the towns that he mentioned. Very leftist town. The problem is a problem of policy. I never said that one shouldn't use excessive force when one needs to use it. One needs to use it for political means in order to achieve some kind of political achievement. And although there's a little bit of disagreement, otherwise it would be boring here, I think that we err in the way we see Lebanon, because when Iran is establishing itself in the north and in the east, then we have to look at the Lebanese issue from the very beginning, and it is unacceptable that Lebanon will flourish with a feeling that there's a Hezbollah state that is running a war from their own territory completely freely, and whatever damage that may be, any collateral damage on that cannery will only be collateral if, God forbid, one of those bombs sort of missed the Hezbollah state, while they can just launch missiles to the center of Tel Aviv and think that we'll succeed in hitting back only with a little pinpointed with tweezers. We won't succeed in doing that. I actually think that they should be included. I think that our friendly states should understand the message that if they enable them to do it from their territory, then of course they're at risk. So, for example, it may take only a few months until Lebanon should reach an understanding that a state called Lebanon should be one state, not with a little sub-state in it. So therefore, it has to have a chief of staff who will understand that if they let the Hezbollah launch those missiles, their own country will be in a state of war. You can't actually, you continue eating fish in Junia while the Hezbollah is shooting missiles. It is launching missiles at Israel. I would like to thank this panel.